The sun rose over the Louisiana swamp, bringing with it a heat that felt like a wet blanket, heavy and suffocating. But inside the thick stone walls of the old convent, the air was cool and still, holding the scent of old wood, beeswax, and faint, lingering incense. For one of the oldest sisters living there, this was the only world she needed. A world measured not by clocks but by the gentle ringing of bells. Her life was a river that had flowed in the same channel for over 50 years, its banks so well worn and familiar that she could navigate them in her sleep. And often, in a way, she did. Her day began before the sun had truly climbed over the cypress trees. The first bell, a soft, melodic chime, pulled her from a thin mattress and a simple, dreamless sleep. Her joints ached a complaint as her bare feet met the cold stone floor. It was a familiar ache, the kind that comes from a body that has worked hard and prayed harder for a very long time. She would wrap herself in the coarse wool of her habit, the fabric feeling like a second skin, a constant reminder of who she was and what she had pledged her life to. With a whispered prayer, she would join the other women, a line of silent, shuffling figures moving through the dim hallways toward the chapel. The morning prayers were a comfort. A familiar rhythm of Latin words and shared silence that connected her to something much larger than herself. Afterward, there was work. Today, her task was the garden. The Louisiana heat was already beginning to flex its muscles, but she didn't mind. She found a quiet peace in the feeling of the cool, dark earth under her fingernails, in the simple, focused task of pulling weeds from around the tomato plants. The other sisters saw her as they saw her every day, a small, slightly stooped woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. They knew her for her quietness, for the way she could sit with a suffering person and say nothing at all, yet make them feel less alone. They knew she could make the best vegetable soup in the whole convent, and that her hands, though wrinkled and spotted with age, could mend a tear in a habit so perfectly it was like it had never been there. They saw a life of service, a life of quiet piety. They saw a woman who had given the world away for God, and in a way they were right. But they didn't see the whole story to them. She was just one of the elderly nuns, a part of the convent's fading tapestry. They didn't know about the girl she had been before she took her vows, a girl who grew up in a small house filled with the sound of a different kind of music. They didn't know about the voice that used to sing along to a crackling radio, a voice full of a raw, untamed spirit that seemed to fly in the face of the quiet, disciplined life she would later choose. That girl was a secret she kept locked away, a ghost that lived in a small, dusty corner of her heart. The day continued its slow, predictable dance. There was a simple lunch of bread, cheese, and vegetables, eaten in a silence broken only by the clinking of forks. There was an afternoon of mending, her needle moving in and out of the worn fabric of a priest's stole with a practiced, steady hand. There were more prayers, more bells, more moments of quiet contemplation. As evening began to paint the sky in shades of orange and purple, the convent settled into its deepest quiet. The final prayers of the day were said, the lights in the hallways were dimmed, and the sisters retreated to their small Spartan cells for the night. This was the time she waited for. This was the time the river of her life branched off into a hidden, secret stream. She would wait in her bed, listening. She would listen to the sounds of the convent going to sleep, the soft cough of a sister in the next room, the creak of floorboards as someone turned over, the distant chirping of crickets outside her window. She would wait until the whole world seemed to be holding its breath, until she was sure everyone was lost in their own dreams. Then, very slowly, very carefully, she would slip out of her bed. Her cell was simple. Just a bed, a small chest, and a tiny window that looked out onto the overgrown courtyard. There was nothing of value in it, nothing that would catch a stranger's eye. But she knelt on the floor and reached under her bed, her hand searching in the dark until her fingers brushed against the rough, familiar shape of a canvas case. She pulled it out, her heart beating a little faster, a thrill that was both exciting and a little bit guilty, like a child stealing a cookie from the jar. Inside the case was a guitar. It was an old acoustic, its wood scarred and stained from a life that had been anything but gentle. A deep gash ran down its side, a dark, jagged scar that she knew by heart. It looked like a relic from another world, and in a way it was. It was the last piece of that other world she still owned. She sat on the edge of her narrow bed, the guitar resting in her lap. Her fingers, stiff and sore from a day of work, felt clumsy at first, but as she positioned them on the fretboard, a kind of muscle memory took over. It was as if her fingers remembered a language her mind had tried to forget. She didn't have any sheet music. She didn't need it. The songs were inside her, etched into her soul, and then she began to play. The sound was not loud. It was a soft, intimate sound that was swallowed by the thick walls of her room and the vast silence of the sleeping convent. But in the small space around her, it was everything. It was not the holy music of the chapel, the solemn organ chords and reverent hymns. This was a different kind of sacred music. It was the sound of the Delta blues, raw and soulful, filled with a sorrow so deep it felt like a prayer and a joy so fierce it felt like a revelation. Her fingers, which seemed so old and frail during the day, began to move with a grace and power that belied her age. They coaxed melodies from the old strings, stories of hard times and sweet love, of loss and longing, of the deep, muddy water of life and the hope of seeing the other side. As she played, her eyes would close and her face, usually so peaceful and serene, would transform. It would become a map of every emotion the music held. Her brow would furrow with a note of pain, and a moment later, a soft smile would touch her lips as a phrase of hope would dance through the air. This was her real prayer. It was a conversation she had with God that no one else could understand. It was her way of telling him about the girl she used to be, about the fears she still had, about the moments of pure, unexplainable beauty she had witnessed in her long life. The music was a bridge between the person she was and the person she had become. It was the part of her that was still human, still a little wild, still full of a passion that she had channeled into her faith, but had never truly extinguished. She played for no one but herself, and the quiet presence she felt in the room with her. She played until her fingers ached and the well of emotion inside her ran dry. Then she would stop, the final note hanging in the air for a moment before disappearing into the silence. A profound peace would settle over her, a feeling of being completely and utterly herself. Carefully, she would wipe the dust from the strings, place the guitar back in its canvas case, and slide it back under her bed. The secret was safe for another night. She would lie down, the echoes of the music still vibrating in her bones, and close her eyes. The old nun was back, the quiet sister, the devoted servant. But she, and she alone, knew the truth. She knew that in the heart of the quietest woman in the convent, a wild, beautiful, and blues-filled soul was singing its heart out. The young man felt like he was driving to the end of the world. The rental car kicked up a cloud of dust on the gravel road that seemed to go nowhere, a thin gray ribbon cutting through a sea of green and brown. He was a journalist, or at least that's what his business card said. In his heart, he felt more like a delivery driver, dropping off words no one really wanted to read. His editor had sent him on this assignment with a sigh, calling it a color piece. The color, he suspected, was the faded, dreary kind of an old photograph. The story was about America's fading institutions, and his first stop was a convent deep in the Louisiana countryside, a place that time seemed to have forgotten. He wasn't there to find hope. He was there to document the slow, quiet end of something. He arrived just as the afternoon sun was beating down with all its might, making the air thick and heavy. The convent was exactly as he'd imagined it, maybe even a little more sad. It was a large, tired-looking building with white paint that was peeling off in long strips, revealing the gray wood underneath. The gardens, which might have once been beautiful, were now overgrown and wild. It looked like a place that was slowly giving up, sinking back into the earth. He parked the car, grabbed his camera bag, and walked toward the heavy wooden front door, feeling a sense of dread. This was going to be a long, boring day. A nun who looked as old as the building itself let him in. She was kind, but her smile was tired and her eyes held a look of quiet resignation. She led him through a series of dim, cool hallways that smelled of lemon polish and old books. Everything was quiet. The only sound was the soft shuffling of their feet on the floor. He was shown into a small reception room and left to wait. He looked around. There was a crucifix on the wall, a few stiff chairs, and a stack of old magazines on a small table. It was a room designed for silence. A room that had no room for a young man with a camera and a deadline. Over the next hour, he did what he came to do. He spoke to a few of the sisters. They were polite, but their answers were short and careful. They spoke of their faith, of their daily routines, of the shrinking number of young women joining their order. They spoke like people who had accepted their fate. He took pictures of peeling window frames, of a chapel with only a handful of nuns praying in the pews, of a dining hall that felt too big and too empty. Every picture he took, every note he jotted down, just confirmed the story he had already written in his head. It was a story about an ending. By late afternoon, he was done. He had enough material for his article, more than enough. He felt a strange mix of pity and frustration. Pity for these women living out their last days in such isolation, and frustration for himself for being stuck writing stories like this. He said his goodbyes to the old nun at the door, got back in his car, and was about to start the engine and drive away, to leave this sad place behind him forever. But something made him hesitate. He decided to take one last walk around the grounds, to stretch his legs before the long drive back to the city. He wandered past the overgrown garden and along the side of the old building. The air was still, the only sounds were the chirping of crickets and the distant buzz of a fly. It was the sound of absolute quiet, a sound that felt like the heartbeat of the place itself. And then, cutting through that quiet, he heard something else. It was a sound so out of place, so strange, that at first he thought he was imagining it. It was the sound of a guitar. But it wasn't the gentle strumming of a campfire song or the holy chords of a hymn. This was something different. It was a sound that was raw and sharp, full of a kind of pain and beauty he had never heard before. It was the sound of the blues, but not the polished blues you hear in a bar. This was the real thing, the kind of blues that comes straight from the soul, unfiltered and honest. It was a sound that seemed to hold all the sadness in the world, but also a flicker of defiant hope. He stood perfectly still, his head cocked to one side, trying to figure out where it was coming from. The music seemed to be coming from a small, open window on the ground floor, a window that was partially hidden behind a curtain of ivy. Curiosity, a feeling he hadn't felt all day, began to pull at him. He forgot all about his deadline and his boring story. He had to know who was making that music. He walked slowly and quietly toward the window, his feet making no sound on the soft grass. He felt like a trespasser, but he couldn't stop himself. As he got closer, the music became clearer, more powerful. He could hear the bend of the strings, the slide of fingers on the fretboard, the deep, emotional moan of the melody. It was a voice without words, telling a story of hardship and love, of loss and survival. It was the most alive thing he had heard in this whole place of quiet endings. He reached the window and carefully, very carefully, pushed a small part of the ivy aside. He peeked inside. The room was small and simple, just a bed, a chest, and a tiny window. And sitting on the edge of the bed, with her eyes closed and her body swaying slightly to the music she was creating, was one of the nuns. It was one of the elderly sisters he had seen earlier, a woman he had barely noticed, a woman who seemed so quiet and frail, so much a part of the convent's fading silence. But she wasn't silent now. In her hands was an old, beat-up acoustic guitar, and she was playing it with a passion and a skill that was breathtaking. Her wrinkled fingers, which had looked so weak and delicate when she was holding her rosary, were now strong and sure on the fretboard. Her face, which had been a mask of peaceful piety, was now alive with emotion. She wasn't just playing notes. She was pouring her entire life story into the music. The young man was completely stunned. He felt like he was witnessing a miracle, a secret that was never meant for his eyes. His first instinct was to leave, to give the woman her privacy. But his journalistic instinct, the part of him that was trained to capture a story, took over. He knew he had to record this. It was too important, too incredible to keep to himself. With a hand that was trembling slightly, he pulled out his phone. He felt a pang of guilt, like he was doing something wrong, something sacrilegious. But he also knew that this was a moment that the world needed to hear. He pointed the phone's camera toward the window, hit record, and stood there, mesmerized. As the old nun played her heart out for an audience of one, after a minute he stopped the recording. He knew he couldn't stay any longer. He quietly backed away from the window, letting the ivy fall back into place. He walked back to his car in a daze, the sound of the blues still echoing in his ears. The world looked different now. The old convent didn't seem like a place of endings anymore. It felt like a place holding a secret, a vibrant, powerful secret. He got in his car and started to drive, but he wasn't the same person who had arrived that morning. The cynical journalist was gone, replaced by a man who had stumbled upon something pure and true. He had a story on his phone, but he knew it was much more than a story. It was a mystery, and he had no idea what he was supposed to do with it. The city lights blurred past his car window, but he didn't see them. All he could see was the old nun's face, her eyes closed, lost in the music. The drive back to his small apartment felt like a dream, or maybe a nightmare. The 1-minute video on his phone felt heavy, like a physical object in his pocket, burning a hole through the fabric. He was a journalist, and his job was to find stories and tell them. But this felt different. This wasn't a story he had found. It was a secret he had stolen. He had invaded the most private moment of a woman who had dedicated her life to peace and privacy, and the guilt of it sat like a stone in his stomach back in his apartment. A place that usually felt like a safe haven, he felt restless. He paced the small space between his couch and his kitchen counter. He poured himself a glass of water, his hand shaking slightly. He played the video again, and again. Each time, the music hit him with the same force. It was so honest, so pure. It was the sound of a soul laid bare. He thought about his article, the one about fading institutions and quiet endings. That story felt like a lie now. He had stumbled upon something that wasn't fading at all. It was a vibrant, living flame, burning quietly in the dark. He felt like a thief who had stolen a jewel, only to find it was so bright he couldn't possibly hide it. What was he supposed to do? Delete it? Pretend it never happened? That felt wrong, too. It felt like a betrayal of the music itself. This music deserved to be heard. It was too powerful, too beautiful to be kept on a phone in a dusty apartment. But sharing it felt like a betrayal of the woman. He was caught between two impossible choices. For hours he sat in the dark, just the glow of his phone illuminating his face. He thought about the nuns, the quiet dignity of their lives. He thought about the old woman's hands, so strong and sure on the guitar neck. He imagined how she would feel if she knew. The shame, the anger, the feeling of being exposed. He couldn't do that to her. He decided he would delete the video. It was the only decent thing to do. He opened his phone, his thumb hovering over the delete button. But he couldn't press it. A different idea started to form in his mind. What if he could share the music without sharing the person? What if he could set it free into the world, but without a name, without a face, without a location? It was a long shot, a crazy idea, but it was the only compromise his conscience would allow. He opened a social media app, one he rarely used. He created a new, anonymous account with no name and no picture. He uploaded the video. His hands were sweating as he typed a simple, short caption, trying to make it as vague as possible. "I was at a convent today. I wasn't expecting this." He read it over and over. It didn't give anything away. It was just a statement of fact, a moment of pure surprise. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes, and hit post. The moment he did, a wave of panic washed over him. What had he done? He threw his phone onto the couch, as if it were a poisonous snake, and walked to his window, looking out at the city. He tried to read a book, but he couldn't focus. He tried to watch TV, but the sound seemed meaningless. All he could think about was that video, floating out there in the digital world. He finally fell into a restless sleep on his couch, fully clothed. Haunted by the sound of a blues guitar, he woke up not to his alarm, but to the frantic, non-stop buzzing of his phone on the coffee table, sounding like a trapped insect. His heart leaped into his throat. He reached for it with a sense of dread. The screen was lit up with a flood of notifications. Hundreds of them, thousands. The video had been shared. A lot. He sat up, his mind racing. He clicked on the post and saw that the view count was in the hundreds of thousands, and it was climbing faster than anything he had ever seen. It was a digital wildfire, spreading through the internet at an unbelievable speed. He started reading the comments. They were from all over the world in different languages, but they all said the same thing. People were stunned. What is this? Who is this? I have tears in my ears. This is the realest music I have ever heard. People were calling her the blues nun, Sister Soul, the saint of slide guitar. Theories were flying around. Some people thought it was a hoax, a clever marketing trick for a new movie. Others thought it was a ghost. But most people just felt a deep, emotional connection to the music. They felt its truth. By noon, it was no longer just an internet sensation. It was a global news story. Major news websites were running articles with headlines like, "Mystery musician takes the world by storm, and who is the woman behind the viral convent blues?" Music critics, who were usually cynical and hard to impress, were writing glowing reviews. A legendary blues guitarist, a man with skin like old leather and a voice like gravel, shared the video on his own page with a simple comment, "This is where the music comes from. The real deal. Forget everything you think you know." His endorsement gave the video a new level of credibility. It wasn't just a viral clip anymore. It was being hailed as an important musical discovery. The young journalist watched all of this unfold on his laptop, feeling like a mad scientist who had lost control of his experiment. He was anonymous, but he knew it was only a matter of time before someone, some tech expert or determined reporter, would trace the video back to his phone. The thrill he had initially felt was now completely replaced by a cold, hard fear. Not for himself, but for the nun. Meanwhile, in a world untouched by Wi-Fi and trending hashtags, the elderly nun was patiently picking caterpillars off the tomato plants in the convent garden. The morning was cool, and the work was quiet and familiar. She was thinking about the coming winter and whether they would have enough canned vegetables to last. She was thinking about a passage she had read in her prayer book that morning. She was completely unaware that her secret, her private prayer, was echoing in the ears of millions of people across the globe. She was unaware that her face, blurred and distant in a 1-minute video, was the most famous face in the world. Her life was a river of peace and quiet, while a storm of unimaginable proportions was gathering just over the horizon. A storm he had created. That evening, the young journalist watched a news report on his laptop. The anchor's face was serious and excited as she spoke of the musical mystery captivating the globe. They showed his grainy video on a giant screen behind her. He had lit a fuse, and now he could only wait for the explosion. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that the quiet world of the convent was about to be shattered forever. And it was all his fault. The first sign that something was wrong was the telephone. It was an old rotary phone that sat on a small desk in the Mother Superior's office, a phone that usually rang no more than twice a day. Now it was screaming. It rang early in the morning during the quiet hours of prayer and late into the night. Its shrill, insistent ring cut through the sacred silence of the convent like a knife. The sisters would look at each other with confused, worried glances, their peaceful routine disrupted by a sound that was becoming a source of deep anxiety. The Mother Superior, a woman who usually carried the weight of her responsibilities with a calm and steady grace, now had a permanent line etched between her eyebrows. She would answer the phone in her office, her voice low and firm, but the sisters who passed by the closed door could hear the urgency in her tone, a tone they had never heard before. Then came the cars. At first, it was just 1 or 2 strangers who would park at the edge of the property and take pictures with their phones. But within a day, the quiet gravel road leading to the convent was lined with them. Then came the larger vehicles, the big white satellite trucks with tall dishes on top, looking like strange, pale flowers that had sprouted from the earth. People were gathering at the front gate, people with cameras and microphones. They weren't shouting, not yet, but their presence was a loud, aggressive statement. They were a crowd of curious eyes, all staring at the old convent, trying to peek through the windows and catch a glimpse of the secret they knew was inside. The convent, which had always been a sanctuary, a world unto itself, suddenly felt like it was under siege. The sisters, who had spent their lives in quiet contemplation, now felt like they were living in a fishbowl. The elderly nun first saw it on the small television in the common room. One of the younger sisters had turned it on, her hands trembling, to a news channel. And there it was. Her face, blurry and small, on a giant screen behind a serious-looking news anchor. They were playing her music. The sound that was her private prayer, her most intimate conversation with God, was now being broadcast to the world, used as background music for a news story. She felt a cold wash of shame and disbelief flood over her. It was like walking into church and finding everyone singing a secret diary entry she had written. She felt naked, exposed. The other sisters looked at her, not with judgment, but with a kind of awe and excitement that was even more painful. They saw a miracle. She saw a violation. She turned off the television and walked back to her small room, closing the door behind her, trying to shut out the world. But she couldn't. The world was already inside her head. The Mother Superior was having a crisis of her own. At first, she was furious. She saw the media attention as a test from God, a temptation, a distraction from their holy work. She had spent the first day on the phone with the diocese, trying to figure out what to do, how to make it stop. But then something changed. A letter had arrived that morning, the final notice from the bank. The convent was deeply in debt. The roof was leaking, the wiring was a fire hazard, and their numbers were so small they could no longer afford to fix it. They were facing foreclosure, the very real possibility of losing their home, the only home most of them had known for decades. It was a problem that felt too big to solve with prayer and garden vegetables alone. And then, as she sat in her office staring at the letter, the phone rang. It was a man from New York, a wealthy businessman who had seen the video. He said he was not a religious man, but the music had moved him in a way he couldn't explain. He wanted to help. He was wiring enough money to not only fix the roof and the wiring, but to secure the convent's future for years to come. He said it was because of the blues nun. After that call, another came, and another. Donations were pouring in from all over the world, from people who had never heard of their convent but had been touched by the music. The Mother Superior put down the phone and looked out her window at the satellite trucks. She saw them not as invaders anymore, but as a strange, unexpected answer to her prayers. It was a miracle, she thought, but a messy, loud, and complicated one. 100 miles away, the young journalist was not celebrating. Every time he went online, he saw the nun's face and he felt a sickening feeling in his gut. He had created a monster. He had taken something pure and beautiful and turned it into a global spectacle. He couldn't sleep. He couldn't eat. The guilt was eating him alive. He knew he had to go back. He had to look her in the eye and apologize, even if she never forgave him. He had to take responsibility for what he had done. He drove back to the convent, his heart pounding in his chest. The scene at the gate was even more chaotic than before. He had to park his car far down the road and walk. He felt like a criminal returning to the scene of the crime. He found a side gate that was unlocked and slipped into the garden, his movements nervous and clumsy. He saw her there, in the vegetable patch, her back to him, trying to weed a row of beans. She looked so small and fragile, trying to find a moment of peace in the middle of the storm he had created. He walked toward her, his throat dry. "Excuse me," he said, his voice barely a whisper. She turned around, and when she saw him, her face didn't change. There was no anger, no surprise, just a deep, profound sadness in her eyes that was worse than any shout. She just looked at him, waiting. I'm the one who... I'm so sorry," he stammered. "I never meant for this to happen. It was supposed to be anonymous. I thought the world needed to hear it, but I didn't think... I'm so sorry." She listened to his whole apology, her face unreadable. When he was finished, she didn't say a word. She just turned her back on him and continued her work, her hands moving in the dirt, dismissing him completely. It was the quietest, most complete rejection he had ever experienced. He stood there for a moment, feeling like a fool, then turned and walked away. His apology hanging in the air, unheard and unaccepted, he left the convent, but the storm was far from over. Inside the stone walls, the elderly nun was trapped. The other sisters were looking at her differently now. They saw her as their savior, the key to their survival. They gently suggested she talk to the reporters to embrace this gift God had given her. "Think of the good we can do with the money," one sister said to her, her eyes bright with hope. But she didn't see it as a gift. She saw it as a curse. Her music, her soul, was now a commodity, a price tag for their salvation. The pressure from her community to save them and her own desire to hide, to return to her quiet life of prayer, was tearing her apart. She was alone in her room, the world outside demanding something from her she could no longer give, and the weight of it all felt like it would crush her. For days, she felt like a ship caught in a storm with no anchor. The world was a loud, crashing wave, and her own community was another, pulling her in a different direction. She would walk through the halls of the convent, and the other sisters would look at her with a mixture of hope and expectation. They didn't mean to pressure her, she knew that. They were good women, women who were scared of losing their home, and she was the only lifeboat they could see. But their hope felt like a weight on her shoulders, a heavy cloak she couldn't shrug off. She spent hours in the chapel, not in peaceful prayer, but in a desperate, silent argument with God. Why had He let this happen? Why had He taken her most private joy, her secret language with Him, and turned it into a public circus? She felt like a tool, an object. And the music she had once loved now felt like a burden. One night, unable to sleep, she knelt in the empty chapel in the pale moonlight. She looked at the statue of Mary, the mother of Jesus, and thought about what it must have been like to have your life's purpose be so much bigger and so much more public than you ever imagined. She thought about the fear and the sacrifice. And in that moment, a thought, clear and quiet, entered her mind. The music was never meant to be a secret to be kept, but a prayer to be shared. But it was her prayer, and she had to decide how and when and where to share it. She had been letting the world decide for her. She realized she couldn't run away from the gift, and she couldn't hide from the need of her sisters. But she could reclaim it. She could take back the control she had lost. The next morning, she went to the Mother Superior's office. The older woman looked at her with tired, expectant eyes. "I will do it," the elderly nun said, her voice quiet but firm. "But it will be on my terms. It will not be a concert. It will not be a show. It will be a benefit held here in our chapel. There will be no bright lights, no big stage, just a chair, and I will play for God and for my sisters. If the world wants to listen, they can listen in. But they will be guests in our church, not an audience at a show." The Mother Superior saw the strength in her eyes, a strength that had been missing for weeks. She saw that this was not a surrender, but an act of leadership. She agreed immediately. The announcement was made to the gathered reporters outside the gate. It was so simple and so unexpected that it confused them. A benefit in a small rural chapel. No tickets for sale, just requests for donations to a fund for the convent. It wasn't the story they had come for. There was no drama of a reluctant star being coaxed out of hiding. There was only a quiet statement of purpose. But the world was intrigued. The mystery of the blues nun had only deepened. The night of the performance, the air in the chapel was thick with a sacred energy. It was not the electric energy of a rock concert, but a deep, humming stillness. The pews were filled with the local townspeople, the nuns from the convent, and a few journalists who had been allowed in, including the young man who had started it all. He sat in the very back, his notebook closed, his camera in his bag. He was not there to report. He was there to witness, to ask for forgiveness in his own quiet way. At the front of the chapel, where the priest usually gave his sermon, there was only a simple wooden chair and a single microphone. Millions of people around the world were watching on a simple live stream, their faces illuminated by the glow of their screens. Waiting. When she walked in, there was no grand entrance. She simply emerged from a side door, wearing her simple habit, carrying her old scarred guitar. She walked to the chair and sat down. The chapel was so quiet you could hear the soft rustle of her wool habit. She looked out at the faces in the pews and then at the simple camera setup. She leaned toward the microphone. "Some of you have been asking about this music," she said, her voice soft but clear with a gentle southern accent. "It's not really something I can explain. It's just my way of talking to God. Sometimes when you're happy or when you're sad, or when you don't have the words, you can sing or you can play. This is just my prayer. I'm going to share it with you now, and I hope it brings you some peace." And then she began to play. The first note filled the silent chapel, and it felt like a sigh of release. It was the same raw, soulful blues from the video, but this time it was different. It wasn't a secret being whispered in the dark. It was a declaration being spoken in the light. She closed her eyes, and her face was a landscape of emotion. She played with a passion that was both fierce and gentle. She played the sorrow of a leaking roof and the fear of losing a home. She played the joy of a sister's kind smile and the peace of a garden in the morning. She played for the young journalist in the back, a song of forgiveness. She played for the millions watching online, a prayer for a world that was often too loud and too lonely. It was the most honest, vulnerable, and powerful performance the world had ever heard. There was no showmanship, only truth. When she played the final note, she let it hang in the air for a long moment before opening her eyes. The chapel was completely silent, but it was a different kind of silence now. It was a holy silence filled with unspoken emotion. In the days that followed, the donations poured in, an astonishing amount that secured the convent's future for generations. But something else happened too. The media frenzy died down. The story didn't have the follow-up they wanted. There was no world tour, no record deal, no dramatic interviews. The nun had given them her soul, and you can't really follow up on something like that. The internet moved on to the next big thing. Life in the convent slowly returned to its normal rhythm, but it was a new normal, a deeper peace. The elderly nun went back to her garden and her prayers. She was no longer just the quiet sister in the corner. She had integrated the two parts of herself, the woman of God and the girl with the blues guitar, into one whole person. In the evenings, sometimes she would bring her old guitar out of her room and sit in the common room. The other sisters would gather around, and she would play for them. The secret was gone, but the music was more alive than ever, no longer a hidden prayer, but a shared song of love, survival, and grace. The world had listened, but in the end, the music had always been for them.